Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the EU Ambassador Lecture. I hope everyone is doing well and remain in high spirits for our discussions today. My name is Ray and I will be the Master of Ceremony for today's event. Today we have here with us His Excellency Vincent Piquet, Ambassador of the European Union to Indonesia and Brunei Darussalam. Welcome, Ambassador. How are you doing today?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ray, and good to see you again.
Good to see you, Ambassador. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, multilateralism is under pressure in the times it is needed the most. The international community is challenged by escalating geopolitical tensions, long-standing great powers rivalries, and non-compliance with international law, among others. Against this backdrop, a question arises on how we maintain rule-based international cooperations in these difficult times. And today, we will be listening from Ambassador Vincent Piquet on reinvigorating rule-based multilateralism in a divided world. Today's lecture will be moderated by Ibu Raras Cahaya Fitri. Ibu Raras is a lecturer at the Department of International Relations, as well as the head of research divisions at the Center for World Trade Studies at Universitas Gadjah Mada. Welcome, Ibu Raras. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm very good, Mas Ray.
Thank you. Today, we are joined by students from universities from the province of Yogyakarta and also Central Java. We have from Universitas Diponegoro, Universitas Gadjah Mada, Universitas Islam Indonesia, Universitas Jenderal Sudirman, Universitas Muhammadiyah Yogyakarta, Universitas Sanata Dharma, and last but not least, UPN Veteran Yogyakarta. Welcome, everybody, and also thank you to our participants who are tuning in our YouTube channel. Before we start, don't forget to share your moments with us from this EU Ambassador Lecture by tagging @FPC Indo, also @uni_Eropa on your social media post. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now begin today's discussions. Please welcome the moderator for today, Ibu Raras. Ibu Raras, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Renaldi. Good day, everyone. Good day, His Excellency Ambassador Vincent Piquet. Thank you for the kind introductions earlier, Mas Renaldi. Thank you also for the participants, all attendees, for taking time to join us today as we will talk about the reinvigorating rule-based multilateralism in divided world. Let me extend my gratitude because it is a great pleasure for me to be your moderator for today's event. By the end of this webinar, I am sure and I do hope that all participants will be benefited from wonderful and insightful topic we discussed today, because we today have the opportunity to meet virtually with His Excellency Ambassador Vincent Piquet, the Ambassador of the European Union to Indonesia and Brunei Darussalam. As I mentioned earlier, and also you have seen from the poster that the FVCI introduced, our topic today is reinvigorating rule-based multilateralism. Allow me to draw your attention to the term reinvigorating. Why? Because first and foremost, I think it is fair to say that the global landscape is currently changing very rapidly. Some of my colleagues here in Universitas Gadjah Mada argue that the current world is experiencing dramatic fundamental changes that we call a mega shift, which particularly is related to various issues, to climate change, to digital transformations, to global pandemic, and also some challenges to democracy. In the last 2 years, we've been also struggling with the global health issue, and these days we're seeing the intensity of conflict among nations. Even with a few at a glance, very glance view on the global landscape so far, we can easily understand that these challenges have kind of ripple effects. What I mean with ripple effects, it's essentially the way how one country attempts to deal with the issues I mentioned earlier will certainly implicate other countries as well. In this sense, then I think it is important for us to ponder to what extent we can encourage cooperations at the global stage to face those challenges. Here to say, reintegrating the rule-based multilateralism could be an approach to do so, especially for developing countries such as Indonesia. So without much further ado, let me stop here and let me now invite Ambassador Piquet to share the topic. His Excellency, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Ibu Araras, for the introduction and for setting the scene so well. And let me thank also, of course, the colleagues from FPCI for hosting me once again. It's always a great pleasure to be with you in your very dynamic and network of international relations students at all levels and in all provinces, or almost all provinces of Indonesia. Look forward very much to this discussion, evidently, with so many universities participating from Central Java and from Yogyakarta. Central Java, Yogyakarta, of course, for a foreign diplomat like myself, wonderful places to travel to, interesting and relevant places, with Yogyakarta very special, of course, because of its historical, cultural, and educational credentials, but also the province of Central Java, one of the key economic engines of the Indonesian economy, and also in terms of population, of course, a very large entity. So I always enjoy visiting your province as well, both in your capital as well as other towns. Today's lecture, the proposal for this title came from FPCI colleagues, and when I heard it, I thought that immediately this is great, and you're hitting the nail on the head, because this is one of the key questions we have in front of us as diplomats, but also as global community, represented in the UN General Assembly, but also as global citizens. This is one of the key questions we have to address. And we can turn to the next page or page 1 on my slide, because as was mentioned earlier on, the multilateral system, as we have come to know it, it is under stress. And this is, of course, not something that has started overnight. This is something that has grown over the past decade, or maybe even decades. And it all has to do with the challenge of any system, whoever has made it, whoever has designed it, whoever has decided it, for any system to keep up to date in a very fast changing global environment. And the global environment, of course, is partly politics. It has to do with the economy and the rising position of economies, one economy versus the other. It has to do with new problems on the global horizon. The most recent concrete case, of course, was the global pandemic, which appeared out of nowhere almost, and which has ruled the world for a good 3 years, almost 2.5 years now. And we all know from our private lives how much this has meant for each and every one of us, and for our societies, for our economies, for the companies, for the poor people in our countries, etc. Multilateralism is also under stress due to evolving political considerations of individual countries, of groups of countries within the global community, and in function of the willingness of countries or of groups of countries to not only abide by the multilateral system, but also to really contribute to the multilateral system. And there's certainly sometimes in some cases a certain lack of action or apathy in terms of keeping the multilateral agenda active, pushing it forward, and to work for results. And working for results in any situation, whether it's your local university or in a country setting or globally, any situation requires compromise, requires the willingness of countries or groups of countries to work for the common good and to put the common good, the global good, as an interest before the specific self-interest or the immediate self-interest of your country, of your region. That is what multilateralism is all about. It's producing results to face global problems, and with a willingness to contribute at least as much, if not more, than you get out of it directly yourself. You build a system for the world to deal with problems, and for the moment you do not have the first consideration of your own system in mind. But this has been under stress for some time for economic and social factors that have emerged over the past 2-3 decades. We have in that connection seen this debate about multilateralism versus multipolarity, and whereby is defined, I mean, Dr. Raras will probably have a better definition as a scholar, but multipolarity is the acceptance or the pursuit even of countries or smaller groups of countries than the world community to pursue the interest of your specific grouping within the multilateral order. It is a worldview that is premised on the acceptance that world power is divided, if you like. Some would say that it is a premise that world power is a zero-sum game. In other words, whatever you get for yourself is something that the other side will not get, and vice versa. So it's quite a different sort of approach in terms of the core of what it is about than is multilateralism. Let's not forget that multilateralism was born after the Second World War, a world war that has had its impact around the world, evidently, in Europe in the first place. In Europe, of course, the western part of Europe, but also the southern part, but particularly also the eastern part of Europe, that has seen its horrible impact also in Africa and also in Asia, especially, of course, East Asia, but let's also not forget other parts of Asia, including Indonesia, where the Second World War has left its terrible damage and destruction as well. So in those days, after the Second World War, of course, the mindset of people, the outlook of people and of countries probably was quite different from how it is now. Back then, our first and principal interest was to rebuild peace out of the Second World War ruins and to come to a new understanding amongst the world community about the prevention of war, and whenever global conflicts or military conflicts appeared, to deal with the avoidance of war or of armed strife as we had it in the Second World War. Today, of course, we are a good 70 or so years after the end of the Second World War. And even though many of us still have maybe not a living memory of the World War II, of course, for the majority of people born after the Second World War, well after the Second World War in many cases, I'm sure many of the participants in the audience are even born in the present century. All of us have probably a different sense of urgency, a sense of necessity about the preservation of peace at a global level. Many of us deal with specific topics in the international affairs, specific agreements, and sometimes it seems to me we have lost the sense of what originally inspired us, setting up this global system, this multilateral system. And that original inspiration was the pursuit of peace and the avoidance of another Second World War. And the fact that we have lost that inspiration is, of course, puts a risk in front of us and in front of the multilateral system, because without that common inspiration, that common sense of purpose, of course, any organization, any framework, any company will lose a sense of direction, and there will be more possibility of internal divisions. And I think that is, in a way, in a very simplistic and non-scholarly way, how I would say the rise of this standoff between multilateralism and multipolarity. Within multilateralism, also make the qualifier about unilateralism. We have seen that happen more often in the past, in the recent history even. Everybody will recall that the United States, under former President Trump, decided to abandon a number of commitments made in the multilateral framework, a commitment to the Paris Accord for climate change, fighting climate change, abandon the World Health Organization, abandon the very difficult and complex draft agreement for handling the nuclear ambitions of Iran. Those were cases of unilateralism in the recent past of the multilateral framework. And of course, it is very worrying that such unilateralism develops, because if the multilateral system as a whole is diminished and has less support, of course, this affects everybody. It's not that a unilateral approach affects only that particular country or region that is unilateral, but it affects everybody. It's like the famous saying, the chain is as strong as all the individual parts. So this is certainly something we have to consider, and also look to the future what are the risks of such unilateralism are on the horizon. And the other thing one can only say is that from the EU side, but I think also from the side of Indonesia, people here and in Europe would say it is very fortunate that President Biden, under the current administration of the US, has rejoined all the frameworks that were abandoned by his predecessor, and we very much feel that the United States is again in business in the multilateral framework. Now, why am I talking about this? All of this multilateralism, and it's very simply because multilateralism is in the EU's DNA. And why am I saying that? First of all, because in our regional context, the EU, of course, like the multilateral system, like the UN Charter, the EU was born in the post-war era, when Europe was still in ruins, and after the Second World War, we had to find a new way forward. And that way forward, it was felt, had to be based on the reconciliation between former enemies, enemies of Nazi Germany, and particularly it had to be based on the reconciliation between Germany and France. So we have in that connection constructed this, first of all, the European community and a few other shapes and guises that you've seen. And now we are, over the past 12 years, we are the European Union. And that is, of course, something that is achieved, again, not overnight. It's a very painstaking and deliberate activity of building a system, building a rule-based system across Europe, with its institutions, with the member states in the Council of Ministers, with the European Commission as the executive branch of the EU, the government of the EU, if you like, and thirdly, of course, the European Parliament. And to create that from scratch, you can easily imagine it in your own ASEAN context, is not an easy thing, and it requires determination and a sense of purpose. And the good thing is that we've had that determination, we've had that sense of purpose, and that's why we have been successful, because that, no matter what you can criticize, etc., we have been successful at constructing this European Union through a rule-based system. And that rule-based system, of course, essentially the objectives are objectives we have in common with the multilateral system, with the UN Charter, with the key treaties, the key conventions that constitute the UN system, whether it's in security, in disarmament, in climate, or in trade. So multilateralism is very close to the EU's heart. Next slide, please. Now, what is multilateralism and who does it? What it is, I have given my attempt at a definition earlier on. It's the pursuit of objectives or values that go over and above your individual national or regional values, but that serve the world. And I stand to be corrected by, by others, of course, and with alternative definitions. The foundation of the multilateral system is the UN Charter. We hear about it a lot, especially now, of course, against the backdrop of Russia's war against Ukraine, a war that 143 countries that are member of the UN think is an illegal and unjustifiable act that violates the UN Charter. Another key treaty or document has the Declaration on Human Rights, adopted shortly after the war. And if you look at or reread that document, then you can only marvel at the sophistication and at the same time the simplicity of what was adopted back then in terms of this value set that was considered the basis of the multilateral institutions, especially UN. Now, there's debate about this, we all know it. Countries have said that they have different interpretations of certain concepts, differences of how these principles of the Declaration of Human Rights apply for them and in their national context. Others say these are universal values and that apply to everyone, and we all must follow this. So this is a substantive debate in the UN and also in bilateral relations between countries that are member of the UN. That certainly is up to top level of the agenda. All the big multilateral agreements have to do with more specialized fields, and I think the biggest one by far has been on the trade side with the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It later developed into the WTO agreement, and its specific sub-agreements are linked to it. Very, very vital for world trade and investment, and without a doubt one of the key areas that we have to cultivate further if we want to sustain the economic and social growth of the membership of the WTO. It all has to do with rules and people who implement the rules or supervise the rules, the institutions. Now for the UN, you know the big institutions. It's the UN bodies. It's the UN General Assembly, the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, to name just the main ones. It's also the specialized agencies in the UN family. And here in Indonesia, where we are located, we have many of these agencies represented. The UN coordinator, we have the WHO, the UNHCR for the refugees, we have the IMO for the migration areas, we have the UN OCHA for the humanitarian aid, we have the FAO, we have the UN Women, we have the World Food Programme of the UN. So a large array of UN bodies are based here. And why am I saying this? Because I think it's a wonderful way to demonstrate that, yes, the UN, the multilateral framework and the multilateral institutions are set up in faraway places from your own country, in New York or in Washington, in the case of the World Bank and the IMF, or in Geneva, in the case of the UN Human Rights Council and the WHO, etc. But at the end of the day, it is also about doing work in your own country with the help of those agencies, with the help of others, in order to realize what the multilateral institutions agree upon. And that's what I mean by action at headquarters and action on the ground in your own country. We can turn to the next slide. Maybe one slide back, please. Let's go back once the slide before, please. Yes, because I still wanted to add something about the relationship of the EU with the UN, the institutional relationship. And the UN system, the multilateral system, was of course designed for nation states, for sovereign states, like Indonesia, like Singapore, like France, Germany, UK, and Canada and the US. Now, where does this leave an entity like the European Union, a regional entity that is a determining factor for some areas of policy inside our European Union, inside our member states? It's the member states of the EU that have always been members of the UN bodies, of the UN General Assembly, for instance. And how do you fit in the European Union? That question became particularly pertinent after the European Union adopted its current treaty, and that is the Treaty of Lisbon, that's the name, after the city where it was signed. And that treaty gives the European Union a legal identity that allows the European Union to represent the EU and its member states on the international stage. And that stage can be bilateral, relations EU-Indonesia. That stage can also be multilateral, the UN General Assembly, as an example. Now, that is all fine for us to agree internally, of course, but it all depends on a negotiation, on convincing the other members of the UN family that the EU has this role to play. And that is not only in line with the division of responsibilities within the EU, but it is also beneficial for the other members of the United Nations. Now that has happened, that acceptance of the EU as a quasi-state member of the United Nations General Assembly. We have a special observer status, which does not, and I should stress that, equate us with a sovereign state membership, but which does give the EU the right to represent the EU member states that are in the UN under the EU heading. And that's a very important step for us for developing our external profile. You can easily imagine that. In another UN agency or multilateral agency, that role for the EU is very, very strong indeed. And I particularly refer to the WTO. And the European Union has internally decided that the EU represents the collective will of member states in trade relations with third countries, in negotiations for FTAs or investment agreements, etc. So we have that mandate from the member states in the area of trade, which means that in the WTO, the EU plays a very prominent role. It represents almost in all areas except for a handful. It represents the common views of the EU, and in the meeting rooms, put it simply, it is the EU that speaks and not the individual member states. Of course, the EU speaks, of course, not just for itself, but it speaks, it delivers the position that has been agreed internally amongst the EU member states. This role has allowed the EU to play a very prominent role in developing the multilateral trade network from GATT to the WTO we have now, and also in the latest agreement that was reached in Geneva in July, multilateral agreement on fisheries and other some agricultural goods. The EU played a, I won't say dominant role, but a very strong leadership role in getting that forward. One last example I would say is the G7. G7 is, as you know, not a treaty-based organization. It's not even an organization. It's the group of the richest, the largest economies in the world. It used to be G8, but as you know, Russia was skipped from the membership list after it invaded Crimea and annexed Crimea in 2014. So it's G7 now, and with 7 sovereign states as members, and still the EU sits at the table, and we are an observer there, and this is in sheer recognition that at any discussion at G7 level about the global economy or for security issues, the EU needs to be present, and in order to get credible decisions and credible conclusions amongst the G7 members. At the end of the day, there's many matters within the EU that member states cannot decide on their own, but they need the EU in order to decide these things. And for that reason, the EU was also admitted to the G7. Different is, by the way, is the G20, where the EU is a member, a full member in its own right. And you will therefore see the EU mentioned in the list of participants, the membership in between China and France. Just to illustrate that the EU's institutional relations with the multilateral institutions, the organizations, and is a complex one. It is something that is evolving in function of what the EU internally decides it wants to do, and in function of what we can bring to the table of the multilateral framework. Next slide, please. This, the title of this slide is clear, and I think that this is pretty well understood. The intellectual understanding, of course, needs to translate into action and practical work and practical results. And that's, of course, where the multilateral framework has had difficulty at times. I will not go into the details of each of these 4 now, can do that in the discussion. But clearly, the multilateral response to the pandemic was, at the start, certainly rather poor, difficult, fragmented, competitive. Nobody thought about anything else except their own sake. And only gradually, with the WHO, with the vaccine distribution mechanism under COVAX, and with the global support, the rich countries for the developing countries, a multilateral response came into being. And that's where we are now, with pursuing that support as EU for the developing countries, not only for the provision of vaccines, but also for the building of vaccine production capacity. We are investing close to 2 billion euros in vaccine production capacity in Africa, for instance, as part of the post-pandemic recovery and as part of the building of resilience to whatever pandemic will hit us tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Climate, the test will be out there in a couple of weeks' times in Sharm el-Sheikh, where Egypt will host the COP number 27, picking up from the Glasgow COP a year ago. Everybody knows that in the current scenario, we are going to way overshoot the 2 degrees centigrade of global warming. And in other words, each of us has to do more for our own sake and for the sake of the globe, for especially the developing countries, especially for the small island states who will literally see their land sink underwater unless something is done on time. So the test is out there. It's a multilateral test that, again, requires a lot of commitment, including financial commitment. And even though I can say that the EU has lived up to its commitments, its financial commitments for climate-related assistance, we still not yet at the level of the 100 of provision of aid by the rich countries to the developing countries at this point in time. So there is a major step to be made forward. The digital economy and artificial intelligence, of course, totally different topics, but I mentioned them here because at the end of the day, these are topics that we all struggle with at the moment in our national settings. We have lots of ambition in developing the digital economy and growing this tremendously promising and vital part of our economies. So similarly, we want to be part of the innovation drive linked to artificial intelligence and be leaders and so on. But if we don't design a multilateral system for regulating this part of public policy, then we will end up in a fragmented world community if it comes to digital and artificial intelligence. And fragmentation means inefficiency and slower growth, slower potential, less sharing, more the efficiency of investment is slower. So it's all very, very undesirable. But of course, the crunch is about which standard do you set and how do you ensure a standard that fits the global framework, not just your own, but also that of a faraway but important other partner. So big debate ahead here, and no easy solutions. And lastly, peace and security. I refer back to what I said about the original inspiration of the multilateral system, the overcoming war and establishing and promoting and pushing peace around the world. And now the test here is, of course, very much out. I won't go into it now so much, but maybe a bit later on, also in the discussion. But of course, the fact that Russia, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, has invaded a sovereign other country, is profoundly troubling and shocking for the multilateral system. Wherever you stand on this matter, such a fundamental abandonment of common rules, mutually agreed rules, is an earth shocker in all respects. So one, it poses, in other words, very profound questions about the strength of a network, a global network, that is not complied with by one of its key members, and that is certainly at risk of being considered ineffective in dealing with global issues like Russia's war. Now, this Russia's war, and of course, is an extreme example of the problems that the UN system has had in the past as well, in failing to bring a resolution to conflicts around the globe. And in the more recent history, we've had, was very severe conflicts in the Near East, in Syria, for instance. We have had conflicts in Africa, in Ethiopia, Eritrea, South Sudan, the Sahel, horrible problems, and in all these cases, the multilateral system has not managed to forge a lasting solution. So we have to think about this very deeply, why this is so and what one can do to diminish these weaknesses. Next slide, please. As part of our support for the multilateral system, of course, one can also should mention the other regional frameworks that exist around the world that are inspired by similar notions of establishing peace and promoting peace and prosperity, etc. And here, ASEAN, we're in Jakarta. I'm in Jakarta. The Secretariat is almost next door. ASEAN is a very important partner in this regard. Similar inspiration as the multilateral system and as the EU's peace, prosperity, and the pursuit of sustainable development. African Union, larger than in terms of countries than the EU, larger than ASEAN, similar orientation, and There are other regional entities, of course, I won't mention them here, but the point I wish to make is that each of these organizations have similar aspirations as does the multilateral system, and therefore they are reinforcements of a multilateral system rather than competitors. And that is the key point to make. They are supportive of the multilateral order as we know it, and cooperate very strongly, certainly in the EU's case, with the UN bodies. Other partners, multilateralism, G20, G7, I've mentioned them, but if you look at what inspires the Indonesian presidency for G20 this year, you will see there very much the same inspiration as the multilateral system. So very important, even though it's an informal platform, the G20 as a G7, very important significance nonetheless. Region to region, you know that EU and ASEAN are close partners, EU and African Union are close partners, and all of us working together must mean that there's a benefit for the multilateral system, the strengthening of the system, and as in all respects, political, economic, social. And the last thing, in country, what do I mean by that? It is a bit reflected by what I said earlier on about the UN network and specialized organizations. We are under instruction from the EU headquarters to work together with the UN in all forms and shapes and guises. So that's what we do. We here in Indonesia, we work with many of the UN organizations very closely, and we finance projects that the UN family implements for us as well at a very practical level. Next slide, please. Just to draw your attention to a policy paper that the EU brought out in February last year. The context was very much our sense that multilateralism is maybe not under attack, but certainly multilateralism is under stress and is vulnerable. And for that reason, we thought we'd try and formulate a number of priorities for the EU to make sure that the multilateral system remains vital and can respond to the questions that we face now, but also tomorrow. Now, this was written before Russia's war to Ukraine, but make the world safer is, of course, now an even stronger imperative than it already was. And the second one is equally relevant, and that is building back better. Also one of the, not the motto, but one of the main ideas behind Indonesia's G20 presidency, building back better to recover from the pandemic, to become stronger and more resilient against future pandemics, and to especially also repair the damage done by the pandemic, especially in the poorer and poorest countries in the world, including the aspect of the food security. Now, this is very much, of course, again, brought back to us by Russia's war. We have, unfortunately, a situation that part of the recovery, if not much of it, that the world was able to make in the past year has been wiped out once again as a result of the food insecurity, and the risk of famine that exists for a good 300 to 600 million people in the developing countries in the next year. And the same is true for the economic growth that we had seen, which is being wiped out by the high inflation, global inflation, food as well as energy. Very, very important topics, problems, and hence priorities for us. The approaches of the EU to all of this, I will not go into detail, except maybe reform to make the UN bodies fit, not but fit for purpose. This is an important one, very difficult one, of course. Everybody seems to agree that the WHO, the World Health Organization, can be made more effective and more resilient and responsive to future health crises. But exactly how to do it is, of course, a matter for discussion. Deal with new issues. I think particularly here worth mentioning the digital and the artificial intelligence side, but let's not forget very topical issues, even though they seem a little bit distant. Topical issues like the use of space, and which we know that space is getting more and more polluted. There's more and more risks of debris, of aircraft, of space vehicles flying about our Earth and destroying space stations and satellites and so on. And of course, secondly, there's also the security side. A code of conduct is needed in order to ensure that civilian spacecraft, civilian satellites do not fall hostage or fall victim to warfare. If we don't do that, if we don't agree such principles, of course, we would be in a very, very difficult shape. Not in general, but for our daily lives, because at the end of the day, our daily lives very much depend on the satellites that Elon Musk is shooting into the skies to run our internet. And the very last point I want to mention is enlarging the EU partnership and our contribution. And there are several ways. Of course, there's money for financing the UN institutions and for supporting the development and implementation of new policy areas. But the other part is something also on our European continent, and that has to do with the gradual inclusion or expansion of the space of European values and objectives of peace as we see it. You know that we are 27 member states. There's 5 or 6 other countries who are candidate member states in the Western Balkans, as we call them, Bosnia, Montenegro, Albania, North Macedonia, and Serbia, and of course, Turkey. Recently, we added Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova to the candidate list. And of course, this is would be a growth of our geographic coverage, which is good for political reasons, for security, stability reasons, and for economic development, and so on. But that's not where it will end, because there is a a call for a greater partnership in a much larger area of across the European continent, especially now. And for that reason, the EU convened just a week or so ago, 10 days ago, the first meeting of the European Political Community, a grouping of 44 countries, so 27 EU member states, plus a number of others, to beyond on the European continent in a wider sense, to talk about consolidation of peace, prosperity, and so on. And this, of course, very much a response to the instability that we see caused by Russia's war. This instability is felt very, very acutely in Europe. Just come back from Europe last night, as a matter of fact, and I can tell you this, that this is on everybody's mind, wherever you live in Europe. And in other words, there is a strong desire for public policy, for foreign policy that reassures this sense of security that we used to have, but that we have lost as a result of Russia's war. I there come to the one but last slide, and which are maybe just mostly topics for the discussion, because I've been talking for far too long already. And the challenges for multilateralism, of course, it has to do with these shifting tectonic plates in global affairs, the rise of Asia, the Asia Pacific, the rise of China, the rise of India, and the rise of some of the BRICS. Of course, the multilateral system was designed at a time when China, when India, and others were not the superpowers that they are now. And of course, this means that something has to be done. And the difficulty is how to do it. Secondly, global goods. This is something more for our citizens, for our economies. They expect our governments to deliver on the climate, on the health matters, on vaccines, on resilience policies against the next pandemic, and it will come, of course. And society, citizens expect the government to work on protecting us against cybercrime, whether it's for commercial reasons or for terrorist purposes. These are key problems that we all face in our day-to-day reality, where, of course, the multilateral system has to deliver, and the big tests are here in front of us. And the last test, I've already referred to it, is the Russian war against Ukraine, a UN Security Permanent member attacking and invading another member state of the same UN family, whose borders are internationally recognized. This is not a civil war situation. This is an invasion. How do we reconcile that fact and the role of the country Russia with its support leadership role in the UN framework? And how can we get the UN system to respond effectively in such a situation? So this is a very, very difficult and profound challenge, and I'd be happy to hear people's ideas in the discussion for that. That's where I stop, and my last slide is, of course, for the further information. Maybe you show it later on as well, so that participants can follow up with the social media. All right, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Piquet. Very wonderful presentations, and also there are a lot of insights that we can discuss later on after this. However, before we go into the Q&A sessions, let me highlight some interesting points in my perspective from Ambassador Piquet presentations. The first one, I am very grateful to see the way Ambassador Piquet outlines the new challenges in multilateralism. In the past, I think the global tensions when the multilateralism was on the rise. In the past, the global tension was probably only about the Cold War, the tensions between especially two power blocks between the US and also the Soviet Union. However, now the challenges are spanning from the emergence of new powers in the global stage, the tendency of countries to pursue their own interests, sometimes at the expense of the global stability and also at the expense of other countries. Also, very important point in these new challenges in multilateralism is, I think, the increasing questions related whether a country or countries are willing to contribute to the global agenda, to contribute to the provisions of the global goods. Second interesting point, I think it's very important that multilateralism needs commitment. It's not only the material commitment, but also non-material commitment. The non-material commitments, I think, related to the first point that I mentioned earlier, it is whether countries can put or at least balance their national interests with the global agenda for the advancement, for the betterment of the world. Meanwhile, material can be in terms as Ambassador Piquet explained how countries are willing to assist one another, especially in the last few years related to the global efforts to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. The third one that drew my interest is that regional partners are very important in multilateralism, especially from the perspective of the European Union. Ambassador Piquet mentioned several partners that the EU have been cooperating with. From Indonesia perspective, ASEAN is important partner for the EU. Is to listen that ASEAN is important partner for the EU is something that we have to be grateful of, that the two regional blocks, that the countries of different hemispheres can collaborate together. Partnerships in multilateralism is important. The last point that I take note on is the point on the contribution of the European Union to multilateralism. Ambassador Piquet, thank you for explaining, elaborating related about these approaches that the EU have been deploying related to the establishment of norms and agreements, also the way it encouraged that are necessary to be familiar, maybe to be aware of the new challenges in multilateralism itself, and also the approach on how the European Union try to deal with the new issues. I think European Union is very leading in especially climate and environmental issues, and also in digital economy and technology related issues. Ambassador Piquet explained how there are now a lot of actors in digital economy and also technology related issues that we are observing to participate in the global agenda. Also, it is, I think this is very important to also highlight that with the EU approaches with its priority of making the world safer and also building back, especially after the COVID pandemic. Those are my take on the presentations delivered by His Excellency Ambassador Piquet. After this, we will be going to the Q&A sessions, but before going there, let me just explain some organizational arrangements for the Q&A. I think Mas Reynaldi already put brief instructions on how attendees can convey their questions. Let me also highlight that apart from writing your questions in the chat box on Zoom and maybe also from the YouTube live chat when you are streaming on the YouTube live, you can also raise your hand in the Q&A sessions that I will be opening in a few minutes. Please, in all the streams of conveying your questions, please keep your question brief. If you're writing your questions in the chat box, please end your questions with question marks so we know exactly to focus on your questions. The FPCI team will forward to me in case there are questions from the YouTube channel. However, if I see some questions on the Zoom chat box, I will try to select some of them. We will have 2 sessions, 2 rounds of questions and answers. In each section, we are expecting to have 2 or 3 questions from the participants. Before going there, let me abuse my rights as a moderator to ask a simple question to Ambassador Piquet. So this is about, while we're waiting for other questions, of course. So this is actually, this is from the perspective of developing countries. In multilateralism, we usually see that there are a lot of countries taking part in any agenda, in any negotiations. However, the issue, I think the issue that when there are a lot of participants, there are also increasing probability that 1 or 2 countries may be in quote free ride in the any measures, in any initiatives that has been in discussions during the multilateral forum. So my questions for Ambassador Piquet is very simple. I think how developing countries that are usually let's say lack in financial support, lack in powerful influence, for example, can also actively participate in multilateralism negotiations or multilateralism initiatives, especially if we're looking this from the EU perspective.
Well, thank you, Ibararas, and thank you also for the wonderful summary of what you did earlier on of my talk. And the beauty of the multilateral system is that it gives space to everybody, and large or small, in terms of population, in terms of economy, in terms of regional interests or global interests. It gives space to everybody, and that is true for the UN system. That's also true for the EU system. We have very large member states. Well, large for us, not so much for Indonesia. Our largest member state is 95 million, which is almost 1/3 of the population of your country. And but we also have very small member states, and take Luxembourg, take Malta. And as I said earlier on, the strength of the chain depends on the weakest link. And it also means that the weakest or the smallest link is as vital as everybody else in terms of making the system work. If you example, we have our Schengen passport-free travel system within the European Union. We cannot afford a weak internal system. So a country, a member state that does not have good security, migration controls, etc., that does not follow the rules. And if that was the case, we wouldn't be able to function. With the multilateral system is the same. If you look at the big multilateral trade negotiations, it always gave plenty of space. They always gave plenty of space to especially the developing countries, the developing world, who were also very strong at times at organizing themselves in different groupings, G77 and G60, G whatever. So that has been quite effective, I think. Also in the climate negotiations, it's the same. It means that even the small countries matter and need to be listened to. Their interests need to be heard. And if you want, in other words, have sustainable global agreements for whatever it is, you need to motivate everybody to make the compromises that need to be made. Because global agreements or regional agreements always require a compromise of one sort or the other. And why do you do that? Why would you have to do that as a person or as a country? It's you see that your compromise creates something bigger and better afterwards. And so that's, I think, the main reason why the multilateral system has been quite effective. And if you look at its functioning right now, then it's not because the smaller countries have difficulty in getting their voice heard, but it is because a number of very big countries feel, or regions, feel that their voice doesn't have enough space. So that is a totally different sort of discussion than the discussion for about the small countries' role.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Davikat. A very interesting point of view as well. Now I will be inviting students to, if any of you wants to raise the questions directly. We've seen several questions posted on the chat box, Mr. Ambassador. So yeah, so I think I will ask some of them who are actually in the Zoom room for now to raise their hand if they want to ask the questions directly. Okay. Or I can also read the questions for them so we can discuss it with the ambassadors. Maybe I think I will read the questions. That's all right. So the first one, we actually received these questions not from the current chat box, but it is posted during the registrations. So some of students already put the questions at the beginning of this webinar. The first one came from Muhammad Izam Dwi from Universitas Islam Indonesia, Yogyakarta. So the questions as follows. Throughout the years since the establishment of the United Nations, we as the community try to drive the world to put a trust towards multilateral platform. However, we cannot deny somehow recently that we are seeing an increasing number of regionalizations despite its motives that leads into prejudice and sentiment. Thus, how does the European Union see this phenomena? Could you please share EU strategy in coping with multilateral trust issues? That's the first question. Maybe would you like to answer the first one, or I need to read the other three? Okay, maybe I will. Yeah, maybe I will take. I will read the other two so that you can respond all of them. The second one, we received questions from Octavianus Bima Saputra from Universitas Gadjah Mada. The question is follows. One of the most talked topic in Indonesia regarding multilateralism is about its role in G20 presidency. As a country with power structure challenges, Indonesia's attempt to hold its leadership in such a perilous time with Russia, Ukraine, and US-China rivalry might jeopardize the unity of the G20 itself. Thus, how do you think the government of Indonesia can play out its South-South narratives to balance the forum and possibly create a tangible solution for the current conflict based on multilateralism aspect? Okay, the next one, this one comes from Gracelyn Cristiano from Universitas Diponegoro. The question is, in the current tension and non-compliant world, is there any other mechanism possible in counterbalancing the fluctuate power in international relations? International law is known to be an instrument that is ineffective in ensuring the well-being of peacemaking, as well as sanctions that might easily be tackled down. Thus, how do we control countries' behavior under this era? Those are the first three questions. His Excellency, Ambassador Piquet, please give your perspective on the three questions.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much. First question from Mohammed from the Universitas Islam in Yogyakarta. I'm not sure if I agree with your underlying thought, the underlying thought of your question that regionalization is bad for multilateralism. I say that because if you look at the EU, if you look at ASEAN, if you look at African Union, if you look at the Latin American Council, Latin American countries, platforms, and so on, their main drive is to create consensus, to create a sense of common identity and purpose in order to solve problems that individually these countries cannot solve. For global peace, you need more countries than yourself, and you need partners, you need friends, and you need strong friends, strong friendship, and that's what the EU has been about. Has it diminished in any way our support for multilateralism? Not at all. Multilateralism is in our veins, is our DNA, as I mentioned earlier. So I think that we have been, very steadfast in our support for multilateralism, and I think the same is true for ASEAN. Look at the ASEAN statute, your basic acts, and look at the four communities, the four pillars of ASEAN. Now, very much, I think, in line with objectives that the UN or the other multilateral organizations stand for. So I see no diminution of multilateralism there at all, and the same goes for the African Union. I won't go into detail now, but so I don't think that regionalization diminishes multilateralism in any sense, and I think if I look at our relations with ASEAN, of course, specifically, then I see a lot of trust. And as we see in ASEAN and in the African Union, entities or unions or bodies that resemble ours, different, of course, not the same, it's not a photocopy, but they resemble our institutional makeup and our general objectives and so on. So that creates a lot of trust, and it helps solve problems. Take ASEAN, Myanmar is a big problem for ASEAN, for Indonesia, and it's also a big problem for us. But we have said from the start, let us follow ASEAN's approach. We know what we want as EU, and that's a return to democracy and a rule of law in one way or another. But we respect ASEAN's leading role in getting this result. And I think you cannot have a greater example of trust than if somebody else tells you, go ahead, we support you. So sometimes there is competition in this or that area, but I think that is more specific, that is maybe more sometimes commercial, or but you know, that does not diminish at all, I think, what I see as the compatibility with regionalization and with multilateralism. The second question, I didn't get the name of the person who asked, but is, I'm sorry for that, but is the G20 jeopardized by rivalries? Well, yes and no. No, in the sense that there's only one rivalry. If you look at, you know, cause and effect, there's only one rivalry that has caused all this very difficult situation for Indonesia as chair, and that is Russia. Russia's invasion has caused this. Had there been no invasion, we would not be having this terrible difficulty for the G20, and Indonesia's presidency would be a lot easier and or more productive. But it's a fact that the war against Ukraine, you know, hangs like a dark cloud over everything. It's a fact, and that's very regrettable for the Indonesian presidency. So that is one. Secondly, have there been rivalries? I don't think so. Maybe differences of opinion and approach, but I still, again, refer to the vote in the UN last week. 143 countries voting, supporting a resolution that condemned the invasion of Ukraine, that rejected these so-called referenda in 4 regions of Ukraine held by Russia, and that refused to accept the annexation by Russia's annexation of those 4 regions. Now, there's 140 countries voting in favor. It is true that there were a number of countries abstaining, including China and India. And of course, we regret that. And we also know where both countries come from. And so we need to see this in the context, and the fact that neither China nor India supported Russia is very important. And you can safely assume that countries who abstained may have had their reasons not to vote in favor, but still they are on the side of the respect for the multilateral system, for the respect of sovereign borders and independence, and etc. So there's only a handful of countries supporting Russia, and that is friendly places like North Korea, Syria, and one or two others. So I think that there is an awful lot of consensus about this matter, about the fact that such a war shouldn't happen in the 21st century, that there may be different considerations about how to get out of it, but the impact of this war on our sense, the global security system, on our sense of stability, is tremendous. The impact of this war on the global economy is tremendous, is horrible. And as always, it's the poor people who suffer, particularly whether those poor people are in the EU, or in Ukraine for that matter, they've had to flee, or whether these poor people are in Africa or in developing Asia. It's they who suffer most of this, and that is just unacceptable, politically and morally unacceptable. And so everybody knows that, regardless of the propaganda that Russia continues to send into the world about, no, it's not our war, but it is the sanctions that cause prices to go up. Well, that's all rubbish, of course, and everybody knows it. So I'm more, I see the problem for the G20 very much, and one can only sympathize with the situation, the position that Indonesia is in. But yeah, this is something that nobody except Russia has wanted to create, and so we have to call on Russia to unwind this problem in order to create a framework for peace. The third question also didn't catch the name, I'm sorry, of the person who asked, but this is the $100 trillion euro rupiah question. If I knew the answer, then whoever, let me put it this way, whoever finds and realizes the answer to that question will get the Nobel Peace Prize next year. Because you have hit with your question on the weakness of the multilateral system, what to do with people who patently violate the understandings and or the legal order. Look at North Korea. You know, there's 120,000 sanctions on them, forbidding missiles launches and development and the whole lot, and still they carry on doing what they do in a seemingly unstoppable manner. Now that's a major problem, and that can only be resolved not militarily, in my opinion, but by a recognition of the key players, the key stakeholders in this situation, that this has to end. This problem has to end. And the key stakeholders, besides South Korea, evidently, are China, Russia, and the US. Japan, Korea, Japan is also, of course, a main stakeholder, but The very big players are Russia, China, and the US. China in particular has a very, very prominent role to play. And the question is, does it play it sufficiently in a way that would re-establish the multilateral order, the laws, in a way that would ensure North Korean compliance with the sanctions, and in a way that would help the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So at the end of the day, it is about acceptance of responsibility for peace on Earth, as opposed to, more specific short-term or medium-term interests that will decide this question. That something needs to happen, I think, is becoming more and more clear. Is this presently the moment that I expect when it will be resolved? I don't think so. I think, of course, the Russia's war is even more present in everybody's mind at the present moment. But how control countries' behavior, how control wayward countries' behavior in a UN multilateral context is a key question. Here again, I do think that regional groupings can help. Look at the EU. We have ways, and sometimes we use them even, to strengthen consensus and to diminish or avoid deviation from our system and so on. And so I think on the whole, in a regional setting, whether it's EU or ASEAN, it can be helpful for dealing with multilateral problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Pickett. Those were very insightful information and also perspective to answer the questions proposed by the students. I'm opening the second round for the questions and answers, and I actually have received an interest from several participants to directly convey their questions. So I will invite Bagas Rifki Hardono from UPN Veteran Yogyakarta to convey the questions directly to His Excellency Ambassador Pickett. Please, Bagas.
Thank you, moderator, for the time, and thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Pickett, for for the explanation. I have a question related to climate issues, climate change issues. As years have gotten, climate change has gotten significant concern in the international community or forum. My question is there any certain position or approach from the European Union to keep the awareness of these climate change challenges, since climate change issues need to be addressed with a multilateral approach, especially since many countries struggle with a pandemic scar in their economic sector in this post-pandemic era. I think that regards my question. Thank you, moderator, and
thank you,
Your
Bagas.
Excellency.
Yeah. So the question is essentially about the approaches applied by the European Union in environmental or climate change issue. I will also invite David from Universitas Jenderal Sudirman, who has also expressed interest to convey the questions directly. Please, David.
Check. Am I audible?
Yes, crystal clear.
Thank you for the opportunity, ma'am. And it's an honor to be able to ask directly to you, Mr. Ambassador. As we all know, Europe in these recent times has faced many challenges that, as consequences, its effect can be felt worldwide in many aspects. Apart from the crisis in Ukraine, right now, UK are facing quite difficult economic crisis. After Brexit, pandemic, the Queen's death, Liz Truss resignation, etc. And my question is, how's the UK instability affect EU and its member states? And how do the EU respond to this issue, especially knowing the proximity of UK to Europe and to EU? Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. The question is related to EU and UK relations, especially after the Brexit. I still have one question to His Excellency Ambassador. This one came from Mutia from Universitas Jenderal Sudirman. I will read the questions. So Mutia says, I am a firm believer of rules-based multilateralism, and I think EU is a perfect model. However, EU is being criticized recently. Could you please share with us your observations on the recent controversial garden versus jungle metaphor by Foreign Minister Joseph Borrell?
Thank you. Thank you to all three askers. First of all, Bagas Rifki, UPN veteran Yogyakarta, about climate action in EU. You know, I think you're right asking this question, because, of course, if you look at the normal citizen sitting in Europe, wherever, right now, seeing inflation, the gas price going up, so the electricity price going up, the gas price they don't even know about, but tremendously, and their monthly bill doubling for energy. The food, overall inflation, 8% year on year, that's massive. So how to keep on convincing that citizen, including myself, that climate action, the COP27 is very important, and we have to do it. That's a very, very true, and it's not easy to explain to people that they have to look beyond what is happening now to something, the crisis that will hit us in 10 years from now, unless we do something about global warming. So I think the answer is twofold. First of all, public awareness raising. Yes, we are still post-pandemic. Yes, we have inflation, but if we forget about climate action, if we forget about global warming, then we will all be in even greater trouble in 10, 15 years from now. And that is objective fact. There's scientific evidence for making that clear. So, sustained, systematic, very intensive explanation and public diplomacy, if you like, is important. Secondly, the answer is also that dealing with high energy inflation is helped, or is by shifting away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. We have made the strategic choice in Europe not to wish to be dependent on Russian gas anymore. We had 40% share Russian gas in our energy mix, far too high in any situation, but certainly in a situation where you're on bad terms with your supplier. And what is the way forward for us is, of course, in the very short term, replacing Russian gas with gas from elsewhere. That's one, and we've been pretty successful at that, even within the space of 2 months, two and a half months, with deals with Norway, the United States, with Egypt, with Israel, with Qatar, and others. But the second answer is investment in renewable energy, especially for Europe. Wind power, offshore wind power, and solar. And these two sources of energy, of renewable energy, will make us totally independent from, over-dependent on Russian gas, certainly, and even less dependent on other imports. And it can be done. We are accelerating our targets in terms of share of the renewables as part of our total energy mix. By 2030, we want to be 45% instead of 38% for renewables. So that is a major increase. And so we make our own energy cheaper, independent. It's cheaper, that is proven. The market has proven it. Renewables are cheaper than fossil sources. And thirdly, we contribute to reducing our CO2 emissions. So a long answer to say that dealing with the immediate problems of price inflation in power can go hand in hand completely with introducing renewables and cutting CO2. So that's another way of keeping the objectives of the global climate action alive. Second question from David, General Sudirman, Universitas, the UK-EU post-Brexit relations. First of all, say that, as our former chief negotiator would say in almost any interview that he gave, this is not our Brexit, it is your Brexit, he said to the UK. It's not our choice. But secondly, we have accepted that and we have negotiated the exit agreement. We have tried to replace it with an agreement that in certain ways repairs the damage, but the limitations set for that agreement by the UK were very tight, very strict. So our bilateral agreement with the UK is far, far from the sort of relationship that we used to have with the UK, and that, whether you like it or not, and it is a loss, an economic loss. It's a people-to-people loss. Travel is more difficult. Two ways, owning property in the UK for us and in the EU for the British is more difficult. So all the things that we had got used to have to be redefined. So the very recent situation, the economic policy, etc., of the UK, I leave aside. That this was a shock for everybody, but particularly, of course, inside the UK, and the damage was tremendous. But that is, I leave that aside. More importantly, I would stress that in areas that are especially vital now, and that is dealing with Russia's war in Ukraine. We have, re-established a very close partnership with the UK. Initially, at the time of the negotiations, the UK was very reticent and, if not reluctant, to engage, to commit to engagement in the security and defense area. Russia's war has brought us, the EU and the UK, together again, if you like, not in an institutional sense, but certainly in the sense of our response to this war, what we need to do about it in terms of military aid to Ukraine, in terms of sanctions, and in terms of overall diplomatic outreach. So that has been a striking event. And the last point is that a positive factor for us, and I think also for the UK, has been that the UK participated in this conference of the European political community 10 days ago, bringing together 44 European countries on the model of common values for stability, for peace, and stability. Last question from Mutia. I forget which university you're based, Mutia, about this particular quotation, the garden versus jungle. My answer would be twofold. It was certainly not the most fortunate expression ever used by High Representative Borrell, but I think we should see this as a slip of the tongue rather than of anything else. It's certainly not a statement of a denigrating statement to one part of the world or another. It was meant as a metaphor to describe the countries that wish peace and security and stability to countries that seek the opposite and that prefer the law of the jungle, and the principle of might makes a right, as it is said. So fundamental for us is to have partners everywhere around the world without exception. We seek partnerships in Asia, especially Indonesia, of course. We seek partnership in Africa, and we are by far the biggest supporter of African social, economic, and sustainable development. We're the biggest development donor in the world, 75 billion euros last year, by far the biggest in the world. And much of it goes to Africa, to the African countries. And the same for Latin America, long historical and cultural links, and also economic. So, in other words, sometimes politicians say things they don't like after having said them, and I think this particular expression is one example of it.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Piket. We have very limited time for now. So yeah, thank you for all the questions, lively discussions. Let me wrap up with one sentence to make the time. So I think from all the presentations, from all the questions, I think if I need to come up with one sentence thesis for the multilateralism, I think there is significance of multilateralism approach to deal with the new global challenges so far. There are critics, of course. However, multilateralism at least can pave the way for the open participations of countries, regardless of their sizes, and also whether they came from Northern Hemisphere or Southern Hemisphere. That's why reinvigorating as the title of the webinar is very, reinvigorating multilateralism is very important. Yeah, thank you all. I think from here I can ask for all participants to thank the Ambassador, His Excellency Vincent Piquet. And here I return the Zoom webinar to the Master of Ceremony.
Thank you so much, Ibu Raras, for an excellent moderating. And thank you, Ambassador, for the insightful lecture. We hope that you enjoyed the discussions as much as we did. And now I would like to invite all the participants here to turn on your camera to have some documentations and also a virtual group photo shoots for today's EU Ambassador lecture. So please turn on your camera, everybody, for a group photo shoots. And don't be shy. Let's see that smile. Yes, come on. Is there anybody else that would like to turn on your camera? We're waiting. Okay, we have more people now. Okay. Okay, so I'm just gonna count to 3. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, one more time. 1, 2, and maybe a little bit of freestyle. Okay, 1, 2, and 3. Yes, okay. Thank you so much, everyone. And with that, we have come to the end of our lecture, the EU Ambassador lecture today. Thank you so much, ambassadors. But before we close, would you like to have a final message that you would like to convey?
No, a warm thank you to everybody, wherever you are, at home or in the university. And I really hope that that we can continue this discussion with FPCI's help very much. I look forward, by the way, to possibly greeting you at FPCI's big annual jamboree happening in November. Am I right, Ray?
5 November.
In Jakarta.
Oh,
Sorry?
in Jakarta. Yeah.
In Jakarta.
26. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, and I look forward to continue our contacts, and thanks very much for your interest. Yes. And thank you very much, Ibu Raras, moderating us so professionally. Terima kasih banyak.
Okay, thank you so much, ambassadors. Thank you, Ibu Raras, for being a great moderator, and also to all the students and all participants who have joined today for your delightful and thought-provoking questions. And now, before we close, I would like to announce that this year's FPCI will be having a Global Town Hall 2022, a North-South-East-West meeting featuring world leaders and leading minds to connect with the global citizens that will take place on 5 November 2022. You can register now at globaltownhall2022.com. Thank you, and see you again at the next EU Ambassador Lecture.